So in the last class, we saw that Daniel was the only one among the wise men that was able to interpret the king's dream. Now, Daniel initially he gave the circumstances in which the king had his dream. He told the king that the king was on his bed and he saw a dream. So here in today's class, we come to the actual dream of the king, and we'll start in verse 31 of chapter 2. So it says that Daniel was said to the king, "You, O king, you were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue, and that statue was large and extraordinary in splendor, and was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome." So Daniel told King Nebuchadnezzar that he saw a statue that was huge in size, and probably it doesn't mention it over here, but in the next chapter, chapter 3, in the first few verses, we see that Nebuchadnezzar builds a statue that was 90 feet tall. Probably Nebuchadnezzar, he based his the building of the statue on the dream he actually saw. So probably he sees a huge statue and then approximately he builds the statue in chapter 3. Now, the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw was had extraordinary splendor, and its appearance was awesome. So, it, the splendor and appearance came from the different metals that was used in the statue. So, verse 32 and 33 says that the head of the statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. So, this is Daniel describing the parts or the materials which made up the statue. The head was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet were made partly of iron and partly of clay. Let me show you how the statue would look. So, this is how the statue would have looked. You see, there's a head of gold, and then there is a silver breastplate with silver arms. Then there was a bronze belly and thighs. Then there was iron legs, and then lastly the legs, they were mixed with iron and clay. So, as you see the formation of the statue from the head to the toes, the materials decrease in value. So, gold being the most valuable, and lastly, the mixture of iron and clay, which is the least valuable. So, this is somewhat the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar saw. So, then Daniel goes on to tell King Nebuchadnezzar in verses 34 and 35, he says to him, "You continued to look until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." So, Daniel told the king that as the king was watching, there was a huge rock. Now, normally, when you see rocks, they are normally cut out of mountains. But here, this rock was not cut out of a mountain, and it is not explicitly said in in these verses, but probably the stone was hurled with some force at the statue, striking its feet and breaking the iron and clay into pieces. Now, not only were the feet and destroyed, but the entire statue of clay, iron, bronze, silver, and gold all fell down as powder to the earth. And the powder was blown away by the wind, and there was no trace of those kingdoms. So then we see that, the stone, it grew into a great mountain and it filled the whole earth. Now, several features of the rock would have impressed Nebuchadnezzar. First, it was a huge supernatural rock. It was not cut with human hands, but it was a part of a mountain. So it was a huge rock. That was one. Then it had extraordinary power, cause it, destroyed the statue. Then third, it it had worldwide significance because the great rock, you know, Daniel in verses 44 and 45 said that it was the coming kingdom of God and its development into a huge mountain signified that it had universal dominion. So this was the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar, short dream, but yet it disturbed the king. Now we see in verse 36 that this dream, Daniel said, now we will tell you its interpretation. When we look at the word we, probably we think that, Daniel and his friends were going to interpret that dream for the king. But we know that Daniel could have only interpreted that dream with the help of God. So it was God and Daniel. And here we see Daniel giving God due respect. And this is what he's telling the king, that it is not him who's doing the work, but it is God who is using Daniel as his agent to help the king interpret his dream. Now, in the dream, Daniel would show the king a picture of four Gentile nations. In verse 37, it says, you, O king, are the king of kings, to whom God of heaven has given kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of field, or the birds of the sky, God has given them into your hand and has caused you to rule over them. You are the head of gold. So Daniel, he tells the king that he is the greatest king of that time. He referred to the king as King of Kings, the greatest king, that is the greatest king on earth. So this is the thing that Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar, that he's the greatest king on earth by referring to him as the King of Kings. But also, at the same time, Daniel was quick to remind Nebuchadnezzar that his position and his stewardship was from God of heaven, who had granted him the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. God had not only made Nebuchadnezzar king and granted him the power, but had also permitted the king to rule over all the inhabitants, the persons, the animals, the birds. So even though Nebuchadnezzar was the greatest king who had dominion over everything, it was God through his sovereignty who had granted Nebuchadnezzar to be the greatest king of that day. Then we go on to see also that Daniel, he commenced his interpretation of the dream by telling Nebuchadnezzar that he was the head of gold. That is, Nebuchadnezzar was that head of gold in the statue. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was the head of the Neo Babylonian Empire for 43 years. Then, after him, another person ruled for 23 years. So, the first kingdom, the kingdom of gold, the Babylonian Empire, lasted for 66 years from 605 BC to 539 BC, and that was the head of gold. But then in verse 39, we see that it says, Daniel says that after you, there will be another kingdom inferior to you, then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. So Daniel, he disclosed that another kingdom would rise after the Babylonian Empire. Now, history tells us that the next kingdom to appear on the scene was the Medo Persian Empire, and that was led by Cyrus the Great. Now, the empire symbolized by the silver chest and the arms, two arms represented the two parties that came, together, the Medians and the Persians. And these two together dominated, the world for 208 years, 539 to 331 BC. So the Media Persian Empire is mentioned here, but very briefly it's mentioned, okay? In chapter 7 and 8, we'll see that, they again come back on the scene, and a bear symbolizes this kingdom in chapter 7 verse 5, and in chapter 8 verse 20 we see a two-horned ram, you know designation designated as Media and Persia. So here we see Daniel describe the second kingdom as inferior, as in, when you think about the word inferior, it means earthward or downward or inferior. Now, this kingdom was inferior to Nebuchadnezzar's empire. Okay. Now, if you look at this kingdom in size, it was way bigger than Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. So, how could Daniel say that such a kingdom was inferior? Now, how was it inferior to Babylon? It was inferior because when Cyrus came to power, the general condition of the world worsened under his monarchy. So the men's vices and corruptions, increased more and more and more. And therefore that empire was inferior to its predecessor. So the sinfulness of the world continued to increase and increase and increase, and that is what made the the Medo Persian Empire inferior. So the third kingdom, the kingdom of bronze, which was represented by the belly and the thighs, was, appeared on the scene, and that followed the Median Persian Empire, and that was Greece. Okay, so in 332 BC, the armies of Alexander the Great, marched against the Medo Persian Empire and defeated it, and these were done in several battles. And then we see the Greek Empire dominated the world for 185 years, from 331 to 146 BC. So Daniel made it clear that these kingdoms rule over the whole earth, that is, over the civilized world of that day. And they were not, individual nations with limited influence. They were great world empires of history. So these were the kingdoms so far. Then Daniel goes on to say that there was a fourth kingdom, and that was as strong as iron, And in as much as iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these also in pieces. So the image, when we saw the image, we saw the legs of iron, and that represent the empire that dominated the world after Greece, and which was the empire that was Rome. Now, if we look at these verses, verse 40 specifically, we see that many terms are used in this verse to emphasize the tremendous power that this fourth kingdom would exert. It said the words are crushes, shatters, breaks in pieces, crush, and break. So, five different words to emphasize the power of this fourth kingdom. Now, Rome ruled the nations like with an iron hand, and all who resisted it, it came and shattered all those nations. So, the fourth empire, Daniel said, will crush and break all the others. So, every time a empire came to power, it would go and conquer the previous empire or absorb its, you know, the land and the property of the previous empire. So Rome conquered Greece, and Greece had conquered Medo Persia, and Persia and Medo had conquered, Babylon. So Rome had gained a lot, gained, three kingdoms, and it was one of the most powerful kingdoms of that day. So in verse 41, 42, and 43, it says that in that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. It will be a divided kingdom, but it will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. Then 42, as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong and part of it will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay. They will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. So we see in these verses 41 to 43 of chapter 2, the empire that began as iron, over time it regressed into a state of clay mixed with iron. Now, this mixture of clay and iron speaks about weakness and deterioration. So, two metals, if you see two metals, if they join together, they form an alloy, and they are strong together than individual metals. But iron and clay, they cannot mix. That's the problem. And they cannot form an alloy. So, if you see, if you take iron and clay and put them into a crucible and heat the crucible to the melting point and pour the mixture back into a mold, when it has cooled, the iron and clay still remain separate. The clay can be broken out, which leaves a weak casting. So, this tells us that the Roman Empire was characterized by division, and this division came because the people were not united. It was not a united nation. Now, the weakness, the why was this empire weak? Now, the empire was strong as an organization, but morally they were the weakest. Okay, imperialism and democracy were united unsuccessfully. So the mobs were also ruling with the government at certain areas. So that was why they were divided. The empire was a mixture of different races and cultures. It was not just the Roman Empire ruling. So, therefore, the Roman Empire was not that strong. It was a divided kingdom. Then it goes on to say in verses 44 and 45, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will self endure forever. In as much as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true and the interpretation is trustworthy. So Daniel mentions that it was the days of those kings, and this refers to the fourth empire, Rome, which saw a succession of kings and emperors for several centuries. So, in contrast to the four kingdoms of verses 41 to 43, which proved to be temporary, here Daniel tells us that God's kingdom shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to another people. So, never be destroyed means that there's no battle or no conqueror that can come and destroy this kingdom. No kingdom can come against this kingdom, and no kingdom can conquer this kingdom. In fact, this kingdom will break in pieces all the kingdoms and bring them to an end, and this kingdom shall stand forever. God's kingdom shall prevail. So, just as Nebuchadnezzar saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and it broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, that rock, that mountain was not a part of the image, it was a separate rock. And it was a stone that was cut by no human hand. We already know that from verse 34. It was, in fact, heavenly in origin, and its duration was eternal. And this was a fifth kingdom superior to the previous four. Now, if we think about what Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 and 32, he reimagined the stone or mountain metaphor when when he spoke about God's kingdom as a grain of mustard seed. And he tells us that a man took and sowed this mustard seed in his field. It was the smallest of all the seeds, but when it had grown, it was larger than all the garden plants and had become a tree, so that even the birds of the air came and made their nests in the branches. So we see that God's kingdom starts small, but it grows much like that stone, and it became a great mountain and filled the earth. Verse 35. So we see that, the prominence of God's rule is, depicted in this chapter. Isaiah also tells us in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2, it says, "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it." Now, Jesus identified himself as the stone from Daniel's interpretation, and he tells us about it in a parable about the wicked tenants. In Luke 20, verse 17, he cites Psalm 118, verse 22, and he says, "The stones that the builder rejected became the chief cornerstone." And then he said, "Everyone who falls on the stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." Luke 20, verse 18. So, having now completed the interpretation of the dream, Daniel reminded Nebuchadnezzar, a great God has made known to the king what shall happen after this. And he also goes on to say that because God of heaven has made this thing known, this dream and this interpretation is sure. And then we see in the next few verses, in the last four verses, that Daniel and his friends they are promoted. In verse 46, it says, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel and gave orders to present to him an offering and fragrant incense. The king answered and said, 'Surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery.' Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and the chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel made request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon. And this all happened while Daniel was at the king's court. So here we see that Nebuchadnezzar responds to Daniel's, interpreting and recounting his dream. And what he does is that firstly, Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face. This is probably because, Nebuchadnezzar was grateful or he was, fearful, or he could have also been overwhelmed by the whole situation. And here we see that Nebuchadnezzar is paying, homage to Daniel, and he commands that an offering and incense be offered to him. Now, here it is not the case that he's worshiping Daniel, but he's paying like some sort of respect to Daniel. And and even though it's not recorded over here, I believe that probably Nebuchadnezzar spoke other words to Daniel also about him, about the greatness of his God. He in fact called the Lord the God of gods and the Lord of lords. So he gave God some prominence, and he confessed that the Lord had some position, but it wasn't a confession where it was him giving his life to the only true living God. Don't be fooled by that. We see that he's only giving him like a place and saying a title to Daniel's God. And then afterwards we see that with that Daniel gets a high honors and promotion. So his gifts consisted, Daniel was given material rewards. In addition to this, the king also made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and the chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel is now the chief advisor to the king. Earlier in the chapter, Daniel was in danger. Now he's not only spared from death, but he ascended in rank under Nebuchadnezzar's authority. Why? Because Daniel had prospered under God's favor. Now, from his new position, Daniel made a request for the sake of his friends. The king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. So while Daniel remained in the king's court, and now we see that he ascends, to a new rank. And in his new ranking, his friends also become overseers in the province. And probably they also are managers over the citizens of that that kingdom. So, as we've been seeing through the chapters, the first chapter ended with the king granting Daniel and his three friends a standing in his court. We see that in chapter 1, verses 19 and verse 21. And the second chapter ends with even greater positions in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. So, this pattern of faithfulness resulting in blessing or promotion will be repeated in also other chapters. We'll see it in chapters 3, in chapters 5, in chapter 6. So, so look at the cycle of Daniel's life so far. He's been taken to a foreign country, but he's been faithful to Yahweh. And then through his faithfulness, he became an advisor to a pagan ruler. Then he interprets the ruler's dreams, and now he's promoted within the kingdom. And this can also be a picture of Joseph. So we see that God did not abandon Joseph, and like that he did not abandon Daniel. Rather, God is with Daniel and his people in the Babylonian captivity. So the Egyptian captivity ended with an exodus when God later raised up a deliverer. Probably, Daniel, he's a new Joseph. He's in Babylonian captivity. So probably there's another exodus in store. So we'll see how, Daniel, throughout the book of Daniel, is faithful and God delivers them out of the various situations that they face. So we see in the book of Daniel that there is a sovereign God in control of everything. So this is our class for today, and then next week we'll go through chapter 3.